In the last video, we looked at the cardiac cycle and how blood moves through the heart. We also looked at some different values for, or different examples of blood volumes like end diastolic and end systolic and so on. Well, there's other variables or other measurements we can use to determine how hard the heart is working, and they also allow us to know whether the heart is not working correctly. So the first one is heart rate, and that's pretty simple. That's just the number of times the heart beats per minute. Average is 60 to 100. If you're below or above that, they have names. It doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. So average is 60 to 100. There is some research out there saying that the 100 for average should be moved down to 90. Again, this is very early research that people above 90, they maybe have an increased risk of having a heart attack at a resting. This is a resting heart rate that we're talking about. So if your resting heart rate is greater than 100, that's called tachycardia. This isn't necessarily bad. What happens mostly when you get tachycardia is, and again, this is a resting heart rate, is you can, and I had this happen to a student, you're sitting there and then suddenly, boom, your heart rate goes from 70 beats a minute to 140 beats a minute. And they don't really know why. I actually had a student in a class and I could see this look on her face. And she just felt really strange. When we took her pulse, it was really high. And she said that had happened to her before, where it goes up and then it comes back down. So they put her on a monitor for a couple weeks and they really couldn't find anything wrong with her. So that's when you're kind of concerned, is when it jumps up for no reason. Bradycardia, on the other hand, is a resting heart rate of less than 60 beats a minute. Again, obviously this is bad if your heart rate gets down to 10 or 0. That's really bad. But if you have a resting heart rate of less than 60, that's not that uncommon for aerobic athletes. So cross-country runners, basketball players, people that do a lot of aerobic exercise. I had a teacher in high school, long-distance runner. His resting heart rate was 45 to 50 beats a minute. So again, it can be a sign of something bad, but it can also be a sign of a fit heart. That means the heart is very strong, and so it pumps out a bunch of blood each beat, so it doesn't need to beat as much. So what controls heart rate? If you remember, we talked about the SA node. The SA node, you talked about this in lab also, the SA node, if it was left on its own devices, if it wasn't connected to the rest of the body, your heart would beat between 90 and 120 beats a minute. We've already talked about how it can go below that, and when you exercise, it easily goes above 120. Just so you have an idea, your maximal heart rate, to get an estimate of it, how many times can your heart actually beat per minute? If an estimate of it is to take 220 minus your age. So just to make the math easy, if you were 20, your maximum heart rate is 200 beats a minute. And we could get you up to that level safely by doing a treadmill test. It's a progressive treadmill test where the workload gets harder. We know that you're working at your max level when your heart rate does get close to that predicted max. But the SA node doesn't work on its own. It's under the influence of the nervous system and of the endocrine system, or hormones, both of which we've talked about before. So which part of the nervous system controls heart rate? Is the autonomic, the somatic, or the central? Now remember, we went through this when we went through the nervous system. I'm going to be nice in this video and I'm going to give you the answer. The answer is the autonomic nervous system. Remember, the autonomic controls parts of your body that you don't want to have to think about. All right, so what is not part of the autonomic nervous system? There are two parts to the autonomic nervous system. I'll give you a hint. One was rest and digest, and the second one was fight or flight. So the answer is what is not part of it. Your brain actually somewhat is a part of it, but the two parts that really aren't. Your somatic nervous system, remember, is motor neurons. So the two parts that are sympathetic and parasympathetic. So this is kind of a tricky question, but just know what's more important is that you know what parts are part of it, and that is the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. So, and again, it somewhat stems from your brain. Remember, your medulla and pons control basic life functions, so it's going to come from the primitive part of your brain. Medulla. Parasympathetic, is it going to increase or decrease your heart rate? I can play Jeopardy music. Da, na, na, na. Your parasympathetic is the rest and digest, so when it's in control of the SA node, it's going to lower your heart rate. Next one should be easy. The sympathetic nervous system then is going to, remember, have sympathy for you. It's going to increase your heart rate. So you're sitting nice and relaxed listening to this video. Your parasympathetic is in control of your heart, but then suddenly a bear breaks through your door. Your heart rate's going to go up because your sympathetic's going to take control. Hormones also have a big influence on heart rate. So you've heard of adrenaline. Another term, and the more scientifically correct term, is epinephrine. Adrenaline is going to increase your heart rate. Thyroid hormones are also going to increase your heart rate, and norepinephrine is another hormone that's going to increase your heart rate. So when that bear jumps in the room, your sympathetic will take over, but that will then cause the release of adrenaline, release of adrenaline from your adrenal glands and keep that going. Your thyroid hormones will raise it. So if you're hyperthyroid, if your thyroid's working too hard, one of the symptoms is that your heart rate is going to be higher than normal. And that's one of the things they would look for if you had a resting heart rate that was too high. Okay, so another measurement is stroke volume, and stroke volume is the volume of blood out of the ventricle in one heartbeat. So when the heart beats, it's going to push blood out of the heart. Stroke volume is how much of that end systolic volume, just a reminder, end systolic volume, how much of that end systolic volume is pushed out of the heart. So stroke volume is a volume number. It's measured in milliliters. It's going to be different for males and females. Okay. Women are going to be less. That's the amount pumped out. Now, a better indicator of heart health is using a number called, or a value called, ejection fraction. And look at the word fraction. It's a percentage. Percentage of blood pumped out of the ventricle per beat. So it really is a good indicator of the strength of the heart muscle. So at rest, about 58% of the blood that is in your ventricles should be pushed out when it beats. Okay, so during ventricular systole, 58% of the blood that's in there should be pushed out. At maximal exercise, about 83%. So even when you're exercising at your hardest, not all the blood leaves your ventricle. There's still 17% that is still there. Now, how can this number be used? And I'll tell you a little story. If your ejection fraction becomes less than 30%, then it's dangerous for a person to exercise, because what happens is they're not getting enough blood out to their body, including their brain. Why this can happen is a virus can attack the heart. If a person's had a heart attack and that heart muscle is dead, then it can't pump. Remember, heart muscle does not regenerate once it's dead. So the example I have is when I used to teach running and walking classes, and even some aerobics, believe it or not, at VU. And I had a student who had a virus attacked her heart. And in young people, that's going to be usually the biggest cause of big heart issues. And so she was also pregnant, which put more of a strain. So she went and got all these tests done. She brought in her values, and I looked at them, and I looked right at this one, and it was about 29%. And so I was like, I did not want her in my class. It's just I thought it was too dangerous. So I told her she needed a note from the doctor. And I'm like, oh, the doctor's never going to give her a note. It's too low. And he did. He said, well, we need to strengthen her heart. And I actually appealed. I told her, you don't have to come to class if you don't want to. And that I've only done that twice, and she was one of them. What she should have been doing, and I actually recommended, is that she go in for what's called cardiac rehab, where they work with doctors and nurses that are there to strengthen up her heart, especially since she was pregnant. So I've only done this, well, it's the only time I did this completely right. I just said, look, I don't want you in class, just because I was not willing to take the risk of something happening to her. So that's ejection fraction. So again, a great indicator of how strong the heart is or how weak it is. Another value for heart volumes is cardiac output, and this is the amount of blood pumped by each ventricle per minute. So cardiac output, stroke volumes, how much comes out per beat. Cardiac output is how much comes out per minute. So a good indication of heart strength, again, aerobically trained athletes, your marathon runners, athletes that do a lot of aerobic exercise, they will have strong cardiac outputs. Okay, so what is the formula for cardiac output? Now, I'm not going to give you the answer in this video, unless it's on the next slide and I didn't check, but I want you to see if you can figure that out on your own. And actually you can from the next slide. So this next slide here looks a little confusing, but it's just showing you the different things that can affect cardiac output. So based on this slide, looking at it, you don't have to understand the whole thing, but it shows you there, if you can read this graph or chart, I guess you can be able to figure out what is the formula for cardiac output. So look at the definition of cardiac output. Think of the two things you need. This is multiply, 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 plus, plus. Think of the two things you need, and then how could you figure out what a person's cardiac output is. So again, this is a chart. We will look at this, and then we will make sure that you understand how to calculate cardiac output. Okay, that's going to be the next section, so we're not going to worry about that. So that's the end of this video on volumes of the heart.